Every state went more red in 2024, so why should we bother voting? Not every state, Dumarilla. What are you talking about? Washington State didn't. They didn't? Nope. And it's in large part thanks to my friend who's the state Democratic chair, Shasti Conrad. Isn't she a DNC vice chair? Yeah, and I got to talk with her all about that. Why they went more blue when other states went red, and what happened with the DNC election. Wait, I have to watch that. Well, you're in luck, because here it is.
Hello, it's so great to be here. I'm Shasti Conrad. I am the chair of the Washington State Democrats and also a vice chair for the DNC.
We have to start with what's happening today at midnight. Very likely shutdown. What is the DNC doing to message on this that it is Republicans responsible? Because I know there's a real concern that the messaging is going to get out of hand.
Well, I think, almost entirely the message is that Republicans have to own this and that this is not how it was in the spring. That Democrats are responding differently than we did back, in the spring, that we really did learn our lessons, that this is not, a Republican Party of like, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago that, you could find some, middle ground and that there was like a way to work together. The Republicans have made that impossible to do that. And so, it's and that we don't take shutting down lightly, because that means that hundreds of thousands of people across this country are going to be without work. They are going to go without paychecks. And it's people like hospital workers, it is people that work at military bases. It is, that's who are the government federal employees are impacted by a federal shutdown. So I think Democrats are really aligned from the DNC, the DCCC, all those various, acronyms and branches and whatnot. But I think that Democrats at our base understand, I hope, that this has to be the Republicans that have to own what is happening, because it is their unwillingness to come to the table. You saw the big press conference this morning on the Capitol steps where, Hakeem Jeffries said, say it to my face when we're back in the Oval Office.
Mr. President, the next time you have something to say about me, don't cop out through a racist and fake AI video. Yeah. When I'm back in the Oval Office, say it to my face.
Like, meet with us to, try to find some middle ground here, but we know that that's not Trump's MO. That's not how the Republicans, Mike Johnson, work at all. So I think we are headed to a shutdown. I think that is where we are going to land. This is the last time this happened was under Trump 1.0 6 years ago. When Democrats have been in office, we have worked through and we have found ways to prevent a shutdown. And, this is entirely, on the Republicans.
What is the DNC doing to message on it? Is there anything like special that you're going to do to fight back that might not get the attention it deserves or needs to get the attention it deserves?
Well, I know, like our chair, Ken Martin, is out there, on every, sort of platform and he's doing media interviews. He did an interview with like Jon Stewart, I think at the end of last week, talking directly about this. I know it's going to sound minor, but the fact that our various, sort of branches of the DCCC, the DSCC, and the DNC being in alignment and working together and being very clear-throated about like how we are talking about this shutdown, and specifically like really talking about the healthcare cuts and how and saying like we are not going to allow them to devastate healthcare, for Americans. That doesn't happen. It's rare for everybody to sort of be on the same page here. And the DNC, I was sent talking points earlier this morning that really showed that, if the Republicans' budget goes through, 75% of Americans are going to have increased insurance premiums. And the people who have been most hurt and the most vulnerable are the ones who are going to get hit worst. The Republicans' budget is all about protecting, the 0.01%, not even the 1%, 0.01%, which are true billionaires. It's about protecting their money, giving them tax cuts so that the rest of us, and truly the rest of us, from Iowa farmers to, educators across this country, like truly everybody, you and me, like just doing our jobs, trying to get by, we are going to be hurt by what the Republicans are doing. And, I mean, and it's one thing, right? I know there's like all kinds of other things that are happening today too, but in any other cycle, the shutdown would be the thing that would be dominating all the news every day for the next several months. But, you know, you also had Hegseth and Trump in front of, 800 generals that are happening. I mean, there's so much sort of devastation that is happening directed by the Republicans.
Are you doing anything in Washington specifically to message about the shutdown?
Here in our Washington, we are really trying to, tell people stories so that folks know, and like, so that this is personalized, that it's not, sort of like in theory that some like, sort of, I don't know, esoteric budget that's, is kind of out there is what they're fighting over. And then whatever happens, happens. It's like, no, there are real people that are going to be impacted. It's like, we have oyster farmers, that are like, that their season's being hurt by this, that we have people who work for Medicaid and Medicare and like Social Security that like are being impacted and can't help like kids and families that are on who are on Medicare. So it's directly happening in our own state, and we're directly trying to amplify those stories. I mean, we are blessed it's not just blessed, we work really hard to get Democrats elected here in our Washington. And so, we have a strong Democratic governor, and we have the majorities in the state legislature, and we have great statewide electeds and great leadership in our congressional delegation. And so they have all been working together to try to mitigate the bad as much as possible. We had a meeting with some labor leaders yesterday to talk about how this was impacting our union members, and what the focus needed to be there, and how as we're preparing for our state legislature session starts in January, as we're starting to work towards that, what are the policies that we can uplift to try to help people, and particularly working folks. So, we're doing what we can here to try to protect our people. But, we're all getting, even in a blue state, right? We're getting hurt by what's happening at the federal and national level.
What do you have to say to people who think that Democrats could just push a little harder, or Democrats could just have a little better messaging, or that they are a little bit weak or not doing as much as they can?
Well, this is what happens when you aren't in power. I mean, this is why elections truly matter. It's not just, oh, you win one, you lose one, up and down. It's like, no, there are real impacts when you don't have the levers of power. We don't have any of the three branches of power, right, of government right now. And so that means the best that we can do is sort of like throw, wrenches in the mix to try to slow it down, try to fight back, try to push, try to do the education piece so that, Americans see what is happening and know what is happening. That's why it's also really important to have Democratic majorities in state legislatures, because, and also at the city municipal levels too, right? It matters who's your mayor. It matters who's on your city council. Again, cannot completely mitigate what is happening and coming from the federal level, but it does mean that there are some, shifts and changes that can be put in place to try to help a little bit. And so, I know that when everything feels like it's on fire, when we see these like wins and special elections, it maybe seems small, but it is a big deal that Democrats are overperforming in something like 43 out of 44 special elections. Like that matters because it gets us to, getting better leadership, better representation, so that when we are back in power, we have what we need to be able to get good things done and put a stop to all of this. So, I think there's worthy criticism of how the, shutdown votes were handled back in the spring. That is not what's happening right now. I think you're seeing a real fight. You're seeing, Democrats from, Schumer and Jeffries all the way down saying, like, we're not going to help the Republicans do this. We are not going to do their bidding. And I, from everything I have seen, our folks, our Democrats are in complete alignment together. And, that I think is a sign of strength. And we're so in the House, we're so close. We're like, 1, 2 people away from getting the majority back. And, I always have to remind people, these votes, like, the SAVE Act and things like that, if you have a Democratic, Speaker of the House, those votes don't make it to the floor. They don't come. They don't happen. This budget, it doesn't include all of these poison pills. It doesn't include, it is a budget that, puts money towards childcare and, money towards helping regular American people. Like that's what a Democratic majority means. And we're so close. We have got to continue to keep our eye on the prize. And I've been using this quote from California Attorney General Rob Bonta a lot. He said, what we need right now is crowds, courts, and courage. And I've been really leaning on that and thinking about the fact that, like, people's activism, I know, like, No King's Day is coming up in a few weeks. That type of outpouring of, we're not going to let this just happen. We're not going to capitulate. Seeing those types of crowds, it's really important to show that, that the majority doesn't support what Trump and the Republicans are doing. That's really important. It also matters that those same people that are protesting, and when we have, numbers like 11 million people participate in a No Kings rally or things like that, you have to go and vote. I mean, and I know people don't like, it's like, oh, just vote harder. It's like, no, you have to participate, because this is how a democracy is supposed to work. And we are going to continue to do that work while we can. And, until we are in power again and we're able to right these wrongs and get the ship corrected. But nothing really matters if we don't have elected leaders who are able to stop this.
How did you do that in Washington? Because I know that you are the only state that went more blue in November. What did you do to make that happen?
A lot of it is we have really strong sort of infrastructure around our elections. We have a full-time staff at the Washington State Democrats. We are doing year-round organizing. One of the big lessons from last year is you can't just start this work in an even year and, like, show up in October and be like, hi, we're here, vote for us. This work is relationship based. It is about building trust and about connecting with people and understanding your base. We knew, for instance, in CD3 with Marie Gluesenkamp Perez, that we had about 48% of a Democratic base in CD3, which meant that we as a Democratic Party could focus on turning out our base, which allowed the candidate, Representative Gluesenkamp Perez, to focus on the persuasion part of it, to really dial into that moderate middle to be able to get over the 50% line and be able to actually win a Trump +5 district. And that's from, having strong data, that's having strong relationships of knowing our voters. I think the other big thing is that, in Washington, we sort of, we kind of run pragmatic progressives. We run people who want to continue to improve, who aren't there just to sit and take the job, but, like, really do want to make improvements and make things better, but aren't burn it down types. Very much are like people who've, like, kind of worked in government, who understand how it works and who want to deliver for people. All of our statewide electeds are folks who have traveled to all 39 of our counties. They get out there, they're actually talking to people. Our new governor, Bob Ferguson, last year really ran on a pretty sort of economic, sort of populist agenda. And he knew that because he was out talking to people. And didn't shy away from having conversations around public safety, which I think many Democrats sometimes have not been willing to wade into that. Talked about the basics of, like, how do people get to work? We have a ferry system in our state that, frustrates a lot of people because they use it to be able to get back and forth to their work and to home. He talked about that. Like, it seems some of that stuff seems kind of like, pretty basic, but that's what matters to people in their everyday lives. And I think that we in Washington have done a really good job of, connecting with our voters and delivering. And, we get the same frustrations that people, folks were mad that our previous governor had, closed the government during COVID for a little bit and, like, mandated vaccines. You get the same kind of, like, anger from the, sort of the right and people being frustrated about certain things. But at the end of the day, we are delivering results that make it so that, We have the strongest credit rating that we've ever had in Washington State. It's higher than the US government for the first time in American history. We're in the top 5 of places to work, places to live, on so many of these kind of like, where do you want to live lists and whatnot. And I think that's really because, we have delivered and we understand that, you want to be in a place where you have clean air, you have clean water, you can, put food on the table. And we're still dealing with the things that everybody's dealing with around affordability. That's true, but we're not afraid to address that and deal with that and talk about things like social housing and talk about ways and actually put forth levies and, policies and initiatives to try to really fight back. And
I could talk to you about Washington forever, but I want to talk about the DNC at least a bit. Can you start with the situation around how you got into the DNC? We've heard that position from the men, but I think it's a really women-centered conversation, and that hasn't gotten the attention it deserves.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, I ran for vice chair alongside, Malcolm Kenyatta, David Hogg. There were 19 candidates back in February. And, I made it through to the final ballot. So the way that the vice chair at large election works is it's sort of where we balance for gender equity across all of the officers. So all of the other offices have been elected, and by the time we got to the 3 vice chair at large positions, it was an even split between men and women, which meant that out of the 3, it could be, we needed to elect 1 woman, 1 man, and then 1 person of any gender. There was a change to the balloting. People were not entirely prepared because we had to vote for 1 person at a time, and there had been an understanding that people would have potentially been able to vote for multiple candidates on the same ballot, and on that first vote, that didn't happen. It was like pretty late into the night, and things were changing on the ground. And so we get through, the body elects Artie Blanco into the first position as vice chair at large. The final ballot, there's 5 people that are on the final ballot. And with the vice chair, even if you have the most votes, you still have to get 50% of the body plus 1. So final ballot comes. It is Malcolm Kenyatta, David Hogg, and then 3 women of color, including myself, the chair from Kansas, Gina Repass, who is a Black woman, and Kaylin Free, who is a Native American woman. The instruction to the body is pick 1 male and then pick someone from any gender. But they were not instructed how to divide that. It meant that in order for Malcolm and David to win, they had to pull from votes that the 3 women didn't have access to. We were only had access to 400 votes, about 400 votes, and the men had access to 800 votes because they could vote for 2 men. On that final ballot, Malcolm clearly wins, and then David comes in second and is declared the winner. Led by Kaylin Free, there is a challenge to the DNC about how that process was done, whether or not, something went awry, and whether or not this is going to be, addressed. At the same time that challenge is moving through, which that challenge was filed at the end of February because it had to be filed within 30 days of the election on February 1st. That same time is when the headlines start to break around David Hogg and, his sort of Leaders We Deserve, the PAC's decision to primary, Democratic incumbents, and those headlines all kind of move in together. Instead of the focus being on the fact that there are, 3 women of color who were impacted by a confusing direction, the women of color totally erased from the narrative, right? The entire focus becomes about some kind of battle that seems to be occurring between, the vice chairs and our chair, Ken Martin, and that sort of takes up all of the air and all of the oxygen in the space. Get to June, the Credentials Committee does say that the challenge does need to go through, that we do need to do a new election so that we can be certain that it was fair. It's going to be separated by gender so that, the ballot that is for a male vice chair only includes people who have identified as male, which is Malcolm and David, and then whoever would lose between the two men would then be moved to join the three women to be on the any gender ballot. And David makes his own decision to resign and to not run again, and then Malcolm is voted on and seated in the male vice chair position, and then we have the any gender ballot, and that's where I then get elected as vice chair. So anyway, I know it's a lot, but I wanted to be really clear that that was what was occurring, and that wasn't because of anything related to David directly. It was about trying to rectify a mistake, an administrative flaw that had happened, back in February in the original election.
And it sucks how that messaging got out of hand and you were lost in kind of the sauce of that messaging, which is very unfortunate, I think. What is one thing that you have been able to do as part of the DNC that has had impact, but you don't think has gotten enough attention?
Thank you for that question. So I got elected in June. It's only been a couple of months, but I've been really proud. One of the very first stops that I made after I was elected was to the Young Democrats of America's convention, because it was very important to me that, young people who rightfully saw a deep connection to David. I didn't want them to feel like they had lost any kind of representation at all. And so I was very appreciative of the warm welcome that I did receive when I was there. I was made an honorary lifetime member, even though, I've aged out a little bit, and being an official Young Dem, but now I get to be a part of the org for life, and I'm really proud of that. And I've really worked to, I really have been wanting to build with young people. I'm our only Asian officer, so really uplifting our AAPI community, because we're so often kind of forgotten, but we are difference makers. We really are often the margin of victory for key races like Warnock and Ossoff's race in Georgia. We really were that difference maker there, and continue to be, as we're the fastest growing demographic, particularly in the South, where much of the population is moving. So that's been really important to me. And then also bringing labor, bringing labor back into the party, and making sure that we were really building a party that puts working folks at the center, and, working families and everything. And that's just been very important to me. And, I went to Memphis and did an event with the Black Teamsters Association down there. And, Trump's targeted Memphis and sending National Guard troops to Memphis in large part because they have a Black mayor, and because, so much of their base are, Black folks, Black voters. And, even now, just this past week, Portland, which is our, neighboring town just a couple hours away. I grew up in Oregon, and we were down in Vancouver this weekend for our state committee meeting. And right across that bridge, you have troops coming in this sort of big moment of, and what I love is that the Northwest is doing it how the Northwest does it, which is it's like they're honking their Subarus and marching in Birkenstocks and doing what we need. But I'm really proud of the fact that I've already been able to sort of jump onto the ground and get involved, and already feel like helping to build the bridge to bring people back into this party.
Well, we're running out of time, but I just thank you so much for this. I hope this gives people shed some light on what's going on in the DNC, what's going on in Washington, and why you should be a name that everyone knows.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate what you're doing. And, you are a great messenger for reminding people that Democrats are winning. We are winning. And, these like what feel like small victories turn into big victories. And,
Yep.
It really, all of this activism really matters, but it really matters when it turns into votes and electoral wins. So, I just think it's really good to keep reminding people, because it's easy to lose hope, but there is some hope here.
There is. All right. Bye.
Thank you.